G'day guys, Sean here from Life and Tennis. So today's video I thought I would discuss the quite topical issue lately, the court surface speed, which was basically initiated by Roger Federer on Andy Roddick's Served podcast, where he brought up that in his view the tournament directors of all the major tournaments throughout the ATP and WTA tour are slowing down the court surfaces to basically suit the top players in the game. And he referenced, Jannik Sinner and Carlos Alcaraz in the men's game. And then he sort of talked about when he was, playing in his playing days, the fact that there were basically 12 tournaments that you had to play every year, and certain players specialised in different tournaments or different surfaces based on the court speed and things like that. So he said it made for a much more interesting tour at the time, and you'd see players pop up for specific tournaments and then, you wouldn't see them at other tournaments later in the year. So yeah, I found those comments very, very interesting. And then of course, the favourite whinger on tour, Alexander Zverev, made some comments at the Shanghai Masters just around how he hates the court surface speed at Shanghai, and basically said they're slowing the court surface down to suit Sinner and Alcaraz. Basically kind of mirroring what Federer said, but in a much less diplomatic way. And if anything, he actually referenced the fact that it's not just the fact that the court surface speeds are slowing down, but they're becoming more similar across the board, across the ATP tour. So yeah, very, very interesting. Even Alex de Minaur agreed with Zverev to an extent, saying that the Shanghai centre court particularly were the slowest conditions he's played at. And, basically saying the balls get humongous after a few games. And yeah, he just found the courts very, very slow. So really, really interesting. You've got, two current players in de Minaur and Zverev, as well as, the greatest of all time, or one of the greatest of all time, Federer, making the comments about the court surface speed slowing down over the years. And so it really got me thinking, I wanted to do a bit more digging into this. I wanted to do a bit of a deep dive analysis on whether there's any truth to what any of these guys have been saying. And look, my conclusions are, to an extent, there is absolutely some truth about the court surfaces slowing down, but I would say the timeline of that happening is much different to what I think a lot of players think. And if anything, if you actually look at the last 5 years, let's say, the court surface speeds have probably been speeding up. The tournament directors have been speeding up a lot of the courts on the major tournaments throughout the year. So let's rewind back to the 90s, and you still had the serve volley contingency of Pete Sampras, who was dominating the tour at the time, as well as Edberg, Becker, Ivanisevic, even. You had a lot of different players that were utilised that serve volley style, but at the same time, and those players dominated on the fast hard courts as well as grass, obviously. But then you also had the more baseline-oriented game styles of Agassi and Chang, for example, who did quite well on the slower surfaces. So obviously Agassi did very, very well at the Australian Open, which probably at the time was maybe a slightly slower hard court than the US Open was. And he won a French Open and made a few French Open finals, as well as Chang, who won the 1989 French Open. So yeah, I guess you had this range of different players that all had different playing styles and all specialised in kind of different surfaces, and did well at those particular tournaments. So yeah, very, very interesting time. But then you reach 1998, and if you look at the US Open and Wimbledon finals of the time, so the US Open final between Philippoussis and Rafter, I think the percentage was something like 79% of rallies in that final were less than 3 shots. And in the Wimbledon final between Pete Sampras and Goran Ivanisevic, a whopping 85% of the rallies were over in less than 3 shots, which is quite ridiculous. So just lots of short points, quick points on serve volleys, things like that, chip charging, all that kind of thing. So yeah, the serve volley era was well and truly at its peak, I would say, at that point. Obviously, you had the grass era prior to that in the 50s, 60s, 70s, before the Grand Slams like the Oz Open and the US Open switched to hard court. But I guess still in 98, it was largely a serve volley game at the time then, and the fast surfaces definitely suited the serve volleyers of the time. And yeah, funny thing happened in 1998, or around that time, there was a fair bit of fan backlash, actually, a fair bit of criticism about how the game was becoming boring. The fans were much preferring the longer grinding rallies on clay at Roland Garros than they were the shorter rallies at Wimbledon or even the US Open, for example. So in 2001, Wimbledon was actually the first tournament to actively slow down their courts by changing their grass courts to 100% ryegrass. Previously, they had a combination of ryegrass and something else, I can't exactly remember, but with the introduction of 100% ryegrass, it basically ensured, like the groundsman, that the soil was like firmer and drier, which meant the balls bounced up higher. And then the following year, in 2001, they actually introduced Type 3 tennis balls, which were essentially 6.5% wider than the balls they were using previously, which meant that the balls would go through the air quicker based on wind resistance because they were slightly larger, and as well as the slower ryegrass, which meant the balls bounced up a little higher. It meant that the conditions were equally favourable to your serve volleys as well as your baseline players. So equally, either strategy, having a baseline style or a serve volley style, was effective. And this was none more the case than the 2002 Wimbledon final between Leighton Hewitt and David Nalbandian, both baseline players. And more importantly, in that match, not a single serve volley point was played, which is quite remarkable. I think it was the first time since 1978 that two baseline players had contested the Wimbledon final. So quite remarkable, like that instant effect of, changing the surface there. And then a year later, the US Open added more sand and paint to their court, which basically had the impact of making the hard courts there slower. So yeah, it started with Wimbledon. The US Open followed suit. The Australian Open was probably the last one to change their surface. They went from, well, they obviously had grass from, basically all the way up until 1988, because originally the Australian Open was hosted at Kooyong, which I'm sure a lot of you guys know. And in 1988, it moved to Melbourne Park, and that's when it changed to hard court. They had basically the surface called Rebound Ace, and then in 2008, that changed to something called Plexicushion, which originally, there was a lot of negative feedback from players, especially Federer, who complained that the courts at the time were slower than they were previously. But actually, if you look at the reasons why Craig Tiley, the tournament director, changed to Plexicushion in 2008, was actually because the court surface was not very durable previously, and that players were complaining that they were a bit sticky, the Rebound Ace, up until 2007. Where some courts were, the bounce was pretty consistent and you wouldn't have any issues. But on those really, really hot days, you'd be you're playing on one of the outside courts, and if it was a hot day, the ball would just skid off the court and basically be just really, really hard to predict where it was going, and it wasn't very reliable, and the court itself wasn't very durable. So we changed to a Plexicushion, which just made the court much, much more durable. Whether or not it was actually slower than Rebound Ace or not remains to be seen. Arguably, it was either the same or if not maybe slightly faster, but maybe to the players it seemed slow, because even Novak at the time in 2008, when he won his first Grand Slam, he won the Oz Open that year, said that the courts did feel slower. So both Federer and Djokovic did, mention that fact. So yeah, that was a very interesting feedback from those two top guys at the time. And then of course you fast forward to the famous Wimbledon final of 2008 between Federer and Nadal, which obviously has since gone down as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, Grand Slam matches of all time. And if you actually look at the statistics of that match, only 57% of points were over in less than 3 shots, which proves that the slowing down of surfaces actually had a positive impact at the time, because you had a really aggressive all-court player like Federer, very evenly matched against a predominantly baseline player in Nadal, and it was extremely even and enthralling match between two completely contrasting styles, which enthralled the crowd for just under 5 hours, which at the time was unheard of really for a match of its type, especially at grass. And really, it was probably paid dividends that the tournament directors did decide to slow down surfaces, which the other Grand Slams would have looked at and gone, okay, this is the right call now, because we're actually getting more fan engagement and we're bringing out the best in the players. So it had the win-win effect of good for the fans, good for the players, and good for the game. So yeah, probably the right decision in the end, which then begs the question, so is Zverev and de Minaur and also Federer are they on the money when they say that the tournament directors are slowing down the court surfaces to suit the top players? And the funny thing is, you need to look at 2020 to counter that argument, because in 2020, both the US Open and the Australian Open actually changed their court supplies, which had the effect of actually speeding up the court surface. So there's actually a thing called the court pace index. So I won't go through the specifics of it, but essentially anything, it's a number rating from essentially, 20 to about 50. So anything which is basically 0, or say 20 to 34 is slow to medium slow, and anything say from 40 and up is medium fast to fast. So the Australian Open from basically 2017 was at 43, so it was already considered a medium fast court, has actually gone up to 50, which is now a fast court. So the Australian Open is actually considered a fast hard court, and the US Open, which previously was in the mid 30s, since they changed court supplier in 2020, is now up at around 43, which makes both the Australian Open and the US Open, they're very fast hard courts at the moment. So anyone that is saying that these courts are slowing down is not on the money, because like I said, the US Open and the Australian Open have been faster hard courts for about 5 years now. So the one thing that is true though is that Shanghai definitely has been slowed down. The court speed went from about 42 to 32, which means it's more of a medium slow hard court. So what Zverev and de Minaur are saying about the courts at the Shanghai Masters is actually true. They are slower than they have been in previous years, but previously they've been one of the quickest Masters surfaces. Well, for a Masters 1000 tournament, they've been one of the quickest hard courts going around. So very, very interesting stuff. So I guess it does beg the question then, are tournament directors slowing down the courts to suit the top players? And the answer is, it's inconclusive. They are constantly looking at the court surfaces and whether they need to increase the court speed or decrease the court speed based on both fan feedback and player feedback. Whether or not it's to suit one or the other remains to be seen. But in the end, they are always looking to, continue to evolve as the game evolves, and also as playing styles evolve, which is also part of the reason why players like Sinner and Alcaraz have contested the last 3 Grand Slams, from Roland Garros, Wimbledon to US Open, 3 completely different surfaces, and they've made the final of each. So if anything, it's not necessarily the court surface that's allowed them to be able to reach those finals. It's their playing styles, and they've adapted to be able to play on the slower clay courts, the quicker grass courts, and the medium fast to medium slow hard court, depending on which way you want to look at it. So in the end, I would say that probably there's an element of truth that Federer, Zverev and de Minaur said that the court surfaces are slowing down to a degree, but at the same time they've also changed in the last 5 years to have been sped up in a number of cases. It's not a one-size-fits-all argument in the end. So very, very interesting analysis, guys. But very keen to hear what your thoughts are on the court surfaces, around the ATP WTA calendar, not just the Grand Slams, and also whether you think it's good for the game, whether you actually have been enjoying the modern game and some of these really, really interesting battles that we've been having this year and in the last, 2 or 3 years, particularly with Alcaraz and Sinner dominating, and players like Sabalenka, Swiatek, Coco Gauff, doing really well, who are all predominantly baseline players. So keen to hear what your thoughts are, guys. But otherwise, please like and subscribe for more life and tennis related content. Cheers, guys.